Hi, this is Kirby Sommers, and as of today, June 29th, I'm changing the title of my podcast from the Epstein Project podcast to the Kirby Sommers True Crime podcast. So today, I will be discussing the Ghislaine Maxwell sentencing, which took place in New York yesterday on June 28th. I will start with telling you what the judge, in this case, Judge Judith Nathan, sentenced her to, and then I'm going to go into detail. So she was sentenced to 20 years, and the 20 years, mind you, include the 2 years for time served. So we're going to make that 18 years. She was fined $750,000. For procuring men for Jeffrey Epstein. And I just want to insert here that, victims did say, even one victim on the stand said that she was trafficked to other men, that the only person that Ghislaine Maxwell was sentenced for procuring victims for was still only for Jeffrey Epstein. She was also sentenced to 5 years probation after her years in jail are sort of, fulfilled. Now, yes, I know all of us know that this is going to change. However, that is the sentencing guidelines of yesterday. Unlike the very first day that she appeared in court, when the trial began in November, when she walked into court like a queen, wearing a silk white top and, a nice pair of expensive black slacks and pumps. And although they were short pumps, yesterday when she walked into the courtroom, she was no longer the socialite wearing Valentino and Manolo Blahniks. Instead, she wore prison blues and shackles around her ankles. And I think that that is more appropriate to what she really is, because she is now no longer the socialite, as mainstream media has called her throughout this 2-year period where she has been in jail by legacy media. And I will remind you that legacy media, which is basically mainstream media, which again is basically Project Mockingbird, her father was a publisher. And of course, all of these, like all of the newspapers and media owned by Rupert Murdoch and all the others, which are just, very few. What are there, like 5 or 6 owners? They're all friends of her family. So they've all called her a socialite. However, she is now a convicted sex trafficker of children. One of the things that was discovered during the sentencing yesterday was that Jeffrey Epstein left Ghislaine Maxwell $10 million from his estate. Now, if you remember, the day before, sort of like a day and a half before Jeffrey Epstein was found suicided in his jail cell, he wrote a new last will and testament. And in that last will and testament, he bequeathed $10 million to Ghislaine Maxwell. In addition to that $10 million, I want to remind you or tell you, in the event you do not know, that Ghislaine Maxwell, along with her lieutenant, Sarah, who changes her name so many times that I don't even know what to call her anymore, because she just recently had another name change. They applied for the Epstein Victims Compensation Fund, which is kind of like being handled again by insiders and the attorneys. And of course, they gave it to her. They gave her whatever money she wanted because, oh, I just get so annoyed that it's hard for people to really comprehend, at least people who only rely on mainstream media, that this was all handled by insiders. And when I say insiders, I mean the intelligence agencies, such as, drumroll, the CIA and the Mossad. So let me just go over my notes here and let me take you during the last 2 years, Glenn's attorneys, Christian Everdale and Bobby Sternheim, and I'm going to say something about each one of them after I make this short statement of fact. They've tried everything to get her sentence reduced, to get her out of jail. I believe they tried to get her bail 5 or 6 times. And, including, including the fact that her eldest brother, Michael, had a horrific accident, which left him, in a coma for 7, 8 years at the time that Ghislaine Maxwell was born in 1960, in December of 1960. So even something like that was brought up. It was brought up that at age 3, the doctor diagnosed her with an eating disorder. I mean, everything they could possibly bring up to try to reduce her sentence. They went into her background. Now, I'll tell you that Ghislaine Maxwell was born into the lap of luxury. And while we know that money alone and the home that one is born into does not mean that you are free of maybe mental abuse, maybe physical abuse, maybe sexual abuse, she never complained about ever having been sexually abused. I want to make that perfectly clear because so many people are saying she was sexually abused. She may have been, but she never once brought that up. It was, and by the way, it was not brought up in the court either. They just said that her father was harsh on her. Well, her own mother, Betty Maxwell, in her book, which is very lengthy, said about Ghislaine that while the rest of the children were chastised and criticized and were, Robert Maxwell was somewhat harsh on them, that Ghislaine received the least of it because she was his favorite. However, they tried to do everything under the sun, say anything under the sun in order to get the judge to reduce her sentence. Now, she was supposed to be sentenced to something like 40 to 65 years. So again, she was sentenced to 20 with time served. So basically she was sentenced to 18. I want to go back and talk about her 2 attorneys, because I know that I was the first person to write about this. And then, the mainstream media journalists who are on my Twitter, like, I hate to use cliches, but I'm going to, like white on rice. They picked up on it. And of course, it's part of mainstream media. I just wish that they would pay me for my work because it is my work. So, for example, Christian Everdale, and I'm reading these from my tweets of July 6th, which is the day that Ghislaine Maxwell was sort of the weekend that Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested. I wrote quick summary, why you need to know about Ghislaine Maxwell's attorney, Christian Everdale, and why it's important in this case. And then I write, Everdale was an SDNY attorney, so that means the Southern District of New York, during which time he prosecuted El Chapo. So if any of you have read my books or are aware of the trafficking of drugs by the United States done by the CIA, you will know that El Chapo was a CIA asset, and that he was helping them get drugs for the Contras. So that sometimes, as we saw with the case of El Chapo, when a drug lord either knows too much or becomes no longer an asset to be used by the intelligence agency, they cut him off. And in this case, they cut him off. And who prosecuted him? Christian Everdale. All right. Let me see if there's anything here that I have skipped out on. So that he left the SDNY after working for them for 10 years. And while attorneys do work on both sides, the CIA connection with El Chapo is important because Jeffrey Epstein with Leslie Wexner is connected legally on paper to Southern Air Transport, which is an airline directly owned by Southern Air, which was implicated in the Iran-Contra. And this is part of a legacy media press. So you can't deny these connections that not just I tell you, but that, even legacy media is telling you. And then we have the other main attorney, which is Bobby Sternheim. Bobby Sternheim is also the attorney for Nicholas Tartaglione. Nicholas Tartaglione, if that name rings a bell, is the man, this major giant guy that if you can think of, I don't know, the Greenpeace giant guy on the label, or you can think of Arnold Schwarzenegger in his heyday, but bigger than that, that he was in jail, or he is in jail for having executed, literally executed, murdered 4 guys in Westchester, New York, for a drug deal gone bad. And he was in jail, and in fact, in the same jail cell as Jeffrey Epstein. And Epstein alleged that Tartaglione had attempted to murder him. Well, it's interesting that Bobby Sternheim, who represents Ghislaine Maxwell, is also representing one of 8 very expensive attorneys, by the way, representing this retired police officer, Tartaglione, who's representing Tartaglione. So the prosecutors detailed how Maxwell and Epstein, and then, they emphasized that they dated during the 1990s. No, they did not. This was a business arrangement. All those photos that were presented in the courtroom of a smiling, hugging Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were posed photos to create the illusion that they were a couple. And how do we know this? Because the victims, and specifically Virginia Giuffre, who lived with them for the better part of a year and a half, never once saw them holding hands, never once saw them kissing, although there are photos that one can find online still, although everything is being scrubbed. So get your photos now, people, because in another month or so, you'll find very little on Epstein and Maxwell. He's found, you can see him snuggling and kissing and being very physically affectionate with young girls, minors, little girls that are maybe 14, 15, 16, so that he was never in that way with Ghislaine Maxwell. So, but that is something that the case that was presented to the public that is on record now. This was not only a narrow case because it only again focused on a short amount of time. It focused on, I believe, the years 1994 through 2001, and it only brought in four, and they didn't even call them victims necessarily. They called them witnesses to describe what happened and what they saw. So this was a very narrow case. And again, so the prosecution detailed, and notice I say the prosecution, not the defense. And that's very important because the way that I have examined this case, the documentation that I have shows that the prosecution and the defense are primarily on the same side. Who are they protecting? They're protecting all of the men and frankly, some very powerful women, including the wife of a former president who I will not name here, but I'm kind of assuming that you get the gist of who I'm talking about. And please do not get uppity when politicians, former presidents, prime ministers, incredibly wealthy businessmen are mentioned, or people in Hollywood are mentioned, because this crosses political lines, not just in the United States, but in other countries. This was an international trafficking ring. So that, again, I'll go back to what I was going to say, which is the prosecutors detailed how Maxwell and Epstein, who, quote, dated in the 80s, preyed on poor, vulnerable teens, luring them into their orbit with the promise of cash and adventure. Selecting these girls was predatory behavior. And again, the prosecutor said that Maxwell and Epstein picked vulnerable girls. Now that is kind of like the storyline they want the public to buy. And from day one, I keep saying, no, that's not the storyline, because while it is true that there were some girls who were from a lower economic household, that were from single mother homes where perhaps the parent or parents had issues, that was not how all of the victims it doesn't portray who all the victims were. In fact, in my newsletter that I sent yesterday, where I go into the life of Morgan Fairchild, and I use that as a portal through which to show you Jeffrey Epstein's life pre the Ghislaine Maxwell days. You can easily see, because I do name one real socialite, one very wealthy woman. I believe now she's in her, I would say, early to mid 30s, who was very much a part of the Jeffrey Epstein crowd, and whose parents for generations were, newspaper barons in San Francisco, namely the Chandler family. So you might know who I'm talking about. So that in my newsletter, which I do call the Epstein Project newsletter, and if you're interested in becoming a subscriber, which is where I send my real information, it's kirbysommers.com/subscribe. I urge you to subscribe, because that's where I'm going to be putting all this information. However, I use that because I also am showing how a lot of these women who were entrapped prior to even Ghislaine coming onto the scene, and frankly, even the generation before Jeffrey Epstein and the generation before that, because we've had an intelligence agency blackmail operation going on for many decades. And again, not just in our country, and our country, I live in the United States. I mean, all of our countries, that's just part of it. That's what they've had. I use it to show that there are some actresses, mainstream actresses, some models, mainstream models with names that everyone is familiar with, soap stars that were part of this. And in the case of Ghislaine Maxwell, two of the four witnesses became very well known in the, how shall we say, in the TV, film industry, in the entertainment industry. Okay. And that was the pact they made. All right. Because I don't know what else to call it. So in one instance, Epstein and Maxwell met one of these girls at the end of her 13th year, then beginning her 14th year. By the time she was 19, she became pretty much well known almost throughout the world, certainly within the United States. So that the deal was, you help us blackmail these powerful men, and which, they were being filmed at the time. I'm not the first person to tell you they were being filmed. And we give you what you want. And that also has been something that has been said consistently throughout everyone's experience with Epstein and Maxwell. They would get to know the girl, find out what her goals and dreams were, turn around and say, we can make that happen for you. Now, some of the girls didn't want to stay. And so we've heard from some of the ones that didn't want to stay, right? So in Virginia's case, Virginia Giuffre, she didn't want to stay. She met them at the tail end of her 15th year. So 1 week before she turned 16. She left when she was, I believe, just before turning 19. So we're hearing from girls who left, but the ones who stayed went on to have lucrative careers as models, as actresses, as opera singers, as politicians. Whatever they wanted, those dreams came, as doctors in many fields. One of those being Eva Dubin. Eva Anderson, you may know her better, and she was one of Jeffrey Epstein's quote girlfriends for about 10 years before he met Ghislaine Maxwell. So during the sentencing of Ghislaine yesterday, Ghislaine Maxwell, she was raised in the UK. So they have a sort of stiff upper lip type mentality. So her face, it was reported, remained, you could not read it. She did not show signs of being distressed. She basically, she was not at all showing any sign of being upset. I would think that if you were sitting in a courtroom and you were being sentenced to this pretty, tawdry, horrific crime against females and young females, that you would show some kind of horror on your face. I would think that it would be not just humiliating, but that you know that you're going to be sentenced to jail. And, Ghislaine Maxwell was born into the life of luxury from the time that she could talk. She had an army of servants who did her bidding, whatever she wanted. She lived in a 53-room mansion on a hill, she went to the best schools, but she showed no sign of anything. The judge did allow for victim statements, and what Maxwell basically said was, it was not even really an apology. She basically said that I'm sorry for the pain that you experienced. But she didn't, nobody felt that statement that she made what came from a place of a sincere place, because throughout they were still trying to say that she was there not because she had committed any crimes, but because Epstein had committed crimes and he was no longer here to be sentenced, and that she in fact was being sentenced in his place. So that the judge did stress to the packed courtroom that Ghislaine Maxwell is not being punished in place of Epstein, that she participated in a horrific scheme and facilitated the sexual abuse by and with Jeffrey Epstein. So let's see, if once she heard her sentence, and who was convicted of sex trafficking on December 29th of 2021, the speculation began about where she would go to jail. So her attorneys requested that she serve out her time at the federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut, which is a low security women's lockup, which served as the inspiration for Netflix Orange is the New Black. However, that's a low security prison, and it's my understanding that anyone who gets sentenced to a certain amount of time, which is much more than what Ghislaine Maxwell was. So let me just see if I have that note here. So if you're sentenced to more than 15 years, which she was sentenced to 20, then that Danbury prison is no longer suitable, because they only accept prisoners that are sentenced below that threshold. So however, she has received, according to her attorneys, threats on her life, and they claim that that will be a determining factor in deciding where to put her. There is, so that Danbury would be a more secure place. However, that it's possible that she might end up at Camp Cupcake in West Virginia, which is the same jail where Martha Stewart spent her time. And let's see. At the end, Ghislaine only hugged her attorneys. She did her sisters, both the twins, Isabel and Christine, were there. Now they look like they have aged during this 2-year time period. I have not seen photos of Ghislaine, and the reason you haven't seen photos of Ghislaine is because photos are not allowed in a courtroom, but there are sketches. No one has really sketched her face in a way that we can tell, has she aged, has she not. There was that one photograph that was taken by Bobby Sternheim when she visited Ghislaine at some point last year, which leaked out, and shows you Ghislaine, does look a lot older. But her sisters look like they've been through the mill. Her brother was also there, just one of them, Kevin. Ian was not. Ian has been the one who has had free reign of Mockingbird media to tell them whatever he's wanted to say. Well, now he could shut up because she has been sentenced. This does not mean they're not going to appeal. In fact, after the court, Bobby Sternheim did confer with the press and said that it would be appealed. And we could expect that this is going to continue to be appealed. One more thing, Christian Everdale was trying to convince the judge, again in this case Judge Nathan, that Maxwell has no money, that Maxwell is indigent, hoping to get the $750,000 fine that was imposed on her removed. So the judge basically turned around and said, hey, she reported $22 million in assets when seeking bail, and that she was unpersuaded that Ghislaine Maxwell is indigent. And so she is going to impose a fine. What I want to say is that in addition to the $10 million that Ghislaine Maxwell received from Jeffrey Epstein's estate, she also sold the $15 million townhome on East 65th Street in New York in 2017 that Jeffrey Epstein gave her. In her deposition during the time that Virginia Giuffre sued her for defamation in 2015, so there was a period of time between 2015 and 2017 when the defamation lawsuit was settled, that there was a period of discovery. And so Ghislaine Maxwell, though she pleaded the fifth and she lied and she evaded another deposition, during one of those depositions, she did say that she could not remember if she ever paid back, quote, the loan that Epstein gave her to buy that house. So what does that mean? So Epstein basically gave her the house, right? So that the $22 million in assets that Ghislaine Maxwell has, which, by the way, is in possession of her husband, who is missing in action, Scott Borgerson. And it's my understanding they're going to be getting a divorce, and he hooked up with a yoga instructor a while ago. But it seems pretty clear where this money came from. But let's not be dissuaded by this, because we know the Maxwells, and we know that, I'm going to just say it, they're criminals, as we can see by her father's actions, as we can see, by what's happened with Ghislaine. And she was just sentenced yesterday. This is a day we will not forget. I'm sure she has money squirreled away outside of the country uh, in the many millions of dollars. So I don't think we have to cry for Ghislaine Maxwell. So it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on this. And if I hear anything else, I certainly will provide an update. So again, this is Kirby Sommers. And like the video, subscribe. Okay, talk soon. Bye.